I lived in the shadows for a long time. Not in the dark, because darkness has its depth. Namely, in the shadows, where there is light, but not for you. Where you are not noticed, not called, not asked. Where you are like a background for other people's stories. I was not alone in the classical sense. People were nearby. Words sounded. But none of them touched me. As if I were transparent. As if my I was something that could be missed. I learned to be comfortable. To smile when necessary. To nod when expected. To say things that do not raise questions. And in all this I gradually stopped seeing myself. Not because I didn't want to. But because I didn't know where to look. Because if no one sees you, you start to think that you are not there. The first crack was made by silence. Not the one in the room, but the one inside. I was sitting in the kitchen, a cup of tea was cooling, and thoughts would not leave. They just stood there, like people who don't know where to go. And then I asked myself for the first time, what if I'm not who they see me as? And it was scary, because if I'm not who I am, then who am I? I started remembering the moments when something inside me screamed, but I kept silent. When I wanted to say, I'm hurting, but I said, everything's fine. When I wanted to stay, but I left. And each such memory was like a fragment of a mirror in which I saw myself, not comfortably smiling, but the real one. Tired, tender, scared, alive. The outside world didn't notice it. And I didn't blame it. Because the world doesn't have to see you if you hide yourself. But something inside me began to change. I no longer wanted to be the background. I wanted to be the frame. Not the main character. Just someone who is visible. It wasn't a loud awakening. There were no tears, no music, no big decisions. It was like breathing that finally became deeper. Like a look in the mirror that you don't look away. Like the phrase, I am, that doesn't need to be proven. I started writing. Not for anyone. For myself. Sentences that had no structure. Words that had no addressee. Just a flow. And in this flow I saw myself for the first time. Not as a function. But as a person. With pain. With hope. With the right to be. It was the beginning. Not a revolution. But an evolution. And I allowed myself to be afraid. Because fear is also a part of me. And if I want to see myself, I have to see everything. Even what is uncomfortable. Even what is frightening. I began to notice that the most important things come not through noise, but through pause. Not through loud events, but through those moments when nothing happens. When you just sit. Just breathe. And suddenly something inside you starts to sound. Not as a thought. Not as a phrase. But as a truth that you haven't heard for a long time. It happened one evening. I came home, tired not from work, but from playing a role all day. I smiled when I didn't want to. I spoke when I wanted to be silent. And when I was finally alone, I didn't turn on the music. I didn't pick up the phone. I just sat down. And the silence that had been frightening before became like a blanket. Not warm, but honest. I began to hear myself. Not with my voice. But with those inner movements that I had previously ignored. How my body reacts to stillness. How thoughts come and go without leaving a trace. How fear doesn't scream, but whispers. And I listened. Not to answer, but to be there. This was new. Because before, I listened to others. Their needs. Their expectations. Their assessments. But not to myself. I forced myself to be silent. Because I thought that my feelings were something to hide. That being sensitive was being weak. And now I heard my sensitivity speak. And she wasn't weak. She was alive. I remembered how I had been afraid of the dark as a child. Not because someone was there. But because there was no one there. And that seemed scarier. But now I sat in the dark, and it wasn't scary. Because I was there. And that was enough. I started writing. Not for someone. For myself. Words that had no structure. Sentences that had no punctuation. Just a flow. And in that flow I heard myself. As a person who no longer wanted to be comfortable. who wanted to be real, even if it was uncomfortable for others. No one asked me how I was, and it was no longer a tragedy. It became a space. Because when you're not asked, you can finally ask yourself, and answer honestly, without the fear of being misunderstood, without the need to be accepted. I allowed myself to be afraid, not to hide the fear, but to keep it close, as proof that I was alive. What I feel, that I haven't disappeared, and there was something tender in that fear, like a hand that trembles but touches anyway. I thought for a long time that I needed to create myself, as an image, as a brand, as a set of traits that others liked. And I carefully collected these traits, from the phrases that were said to me, from the reactions to my actions, from the silence after my words. I was like an architect building a house that he himself did not live in, because each room was for someone else, and I was just a watchman. But something changed. Not suddenly, but slowly, like water sharpening a stone. I began to notice that some parts of me, the ones that I had hidden, had not disappeared. They were simply waiting, like old letters that were not thrown away, but were not read either. And I began to open them, one by one. I remembered how, as a child, I loved to be silent. Not because I was shy, but because I listened. The world, myself, others, and how I was told, speak more, be more active, don't be strange. And I learned to speak. I learned to be active. I learned to be normal. But I lost myself. The one who listens. The one who is silent not out of fear, but out of depth. I remembered how I loved to write strange sentences. Without logic. Without structure. Just a flow. And how they told me, this is not serious. This is not literature. And I stopped writing, because I thought my words were wrong. And now I read them, and they sound like me. Not as an author, but as a person. I remembered how I was afraid to cry, because tears are weakness. That's what I was told. And I learned to hold back. I learned to smile when it hurts. I learned to be strong. But now I cry. And it's not weakness. It's true. It's me. I began to recognize myself, not as an image, but as a presence, as something that doesn't need to be created, because it already exists. It was just hidden, under masks, under fears, under, should be like this. It was uncomfortable, because some parts of me are strange, unpredictable, tender, and I was afraid that they wouldn't be accepted. But I didn't want to live for acceptance anymore. I wanted to live for the truth. And the truth is me. In all my awkwardness, in all my depth, in all my silence, I allowed myself to be afraid. Because fear is me too. And if I want to see myself, I have to see everything. Even what I don't like. Even what scares me. Because only then am I real. For a long time I thought that acceptance was something external. That someone had to say, you are normal, you are good, you are worthy. And I waited. Years. From friends, from family, from random people who could see something more in me. But no one said. Not because I was invisible, but because they themselves were looking for it within themselves. And I could wait no longer. I began to accept myself. Not as an act of pride, but as an act of survival. Because if I do not accept myself, I will disappear. Not physically, but internally, like a shadow that no longer has a source of light. It was uncomfortable, because some parts of me are strange. I like to be silent when everyone is talking. I like to look at people without interfering. I like to write sentences that no one understands. And before I thought that this had to change. That I had to be like everyone else. But now I saw, this is me. And I don't want to hide myself anymore. I started to talk to myself. Not out loud. Just in my mind. Like a friend I hadn't seen in a long time. I asked, are you comfortable? Are you tired? Do you want to be here? And the answers were honest. Sometimes painful. Sometimes gentle. But always mine. I allowed myself to be uncomfortable. Not to answer right away. Not to smile when I didn't want to. Not to explain why I was silent. Because I no longer wanted to be understood. I wanted to be real. I remembered the moment when someone said, "You are very complicated." And I apologized then. I said, "I will try to be simpler." And now I would answer, "Yes, I am complicated, because I am alive. And in this complexity is my beauty." I began to accept my fears, not as enemies, but as a part of myself. The fear of being abandoned, the fear of being unnecessary, the fear of being strange. They have not disappeared, but I no longer hide them. I say, "You can be here. I see you. But I am moving on." It wasn't easy. Acceptance is not a moment. It's a process. Like breathing. Like healing. Like love that doesn't scream, but simply is. And I no longer waited for someone to see me. Because I had already seen myself. And that was enough. For a long time I thought that being yourself was something that happened automatically. That it was enough to simply be honest, and everything would work out. But it turned out that being yourself is a daily job. Like breathing, which you must not forget. Like water, which you must drink, even when you don't want to. Because otherwise, you dry up. I began to live as myself. Not as an image. Not as a role. But as a person who no longer wants to play. And it was uncomfortable. Because the world got used to me being different. Someone who smiles when it hurts. Someone who agrees when he doesn't want to. Someone who is silent when he needs to speak. And when I started to change, the world didn't applaud. The world was surprised. And some left. I no longer apologized for my depth. For my silence. For my tenderness. I no longer tried to be easy to perceive. I simply was. And it became my choice. Not a protest. But an agreement with myself. I started saying, no. Not rudely. Not angrily. But calmly. Like a person who knows his limit. And each no was like a stone in the foundation of my house. Because I no longer wanted to live in other people's rooms. I wanted to have my own space. Even if it was small. Even if it wasn't to everyone's liking. I started writing openly. Without hiding emotions. Without smoothing out corners. And some readers said, "This is too personal." And I thought, yes. Because I am a person. And if my words are uncomfortable, it means they are alive. I allowed myself to be strange. To speak slowly. To be silent for a long time. To cry at films that others called banal. To rejoice in little things that no one noticed. And it was not a demonstration. This was life. I no longer waited for permission. Because I already had it, from myself. And that was the most important permission. To live. As I am. Not as expected. Not as convenient. But as real. I allowed myself to be afraid. Because fear is not something to be conquered. It is something to be taken by the hand. And to go. Even if you are trembling. Even if you do not know where. Because the main thing is to go as you are. And not as someone you have never been. I thought for a long time that I needed to protect myself. Like something fragile. Like something that could easily break. And I hid. In silence. In smiles. In phrases like, "Everything is fine." Because the world seemed loud, demanding, impatient. And I didn't know if I could stand it. But now, I'm not hiding. I'm sharing. Not with everyone. Not always. But honestly. I started speaking. Not to convince. But to be. I wrote texts that didn't explain, but simply existed. I left pauses that didn't need to be filled. I created a space in which others could be themselves, without fear, without roles, without shoulds. I was no longer afraid of being misunderstood. Because I didn't understand myself for a long time. And if someone doesn't see me, it's not a tragedy. It's just a fact. And I can already see. And that's enough to live. And to share. I began to notice people who were also silent. Not because they had nothing to say. But because no one was listening to them. And I listened. Not as a therapist. Not as a savior. But as someone who knows what it's like to be unnoticed. And there was more love in that listening than in any advice. I no longer tried to be right. I was real. And that became my gift to others. Because when you are real, you allow others to be the same. And that is the deepest healing. I left my texts in places where they could be found. In notes. In videos. In the silence between the words. And if someone read it, that's fine. If not, that's fine too. Because I was no longer writing for recognition. I was writing for presence. I allowed myself to be afraid. And to talk about it. And that became an invitation. For those who are also afraid. Because fear is not something to be conquered. It is something to be lived. Together. Next to each other. Without shame. I learned to see myself. Not as perfect. Not as complete. But as alive. And that is the most important thing. Because when you are alive, you can be. And you can share. And you can leave behind not an image, but a space. In which others will say, I can be myself too.